He had sand in his throat and galaxies in his eyes when he reached for her hand, and for a second Maya thought the world would tear open there on the scrubland, the way it had the night her helicopter went down, and the way silence had hollowed her afterward. He screamed without sound, a rasp of static that made the hairs lift at the base of her neck, and the desert wind answered him like someone trying to translate a sob into a language it didn't know. Maya moved before she thought, because moving was what she'd been trained to do. She dug with bare hands until the ridged, iridescent skin gleamed like oil, and the fragile thing beneath it coughed salt and starlight. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. He called himself Kale in syllables that slid between the words in her head, not spoken but understood, an invitation and a warning. His face, when she finally saw it, was too lean to be human and too whole to be a monster. High cheekbones like cut glass, a mouth that trembled each time he tried to force English through an apparatus of breath, eyes that reflected the star he had fallen from. The thin membrane across his left forearm pulsed with a pale light, a map or a magnet. He stared at her as if trying to memorize the human shape of her hands. "Kill," he said once, voice like distant radio static. Then, quieter, "Help." Her first thought was protocol. Her second was the memory of Lieutenant Chavez's empty bunk and the way command had told them to move on. Her fingers remembered the sterilized pinch of a tourniquet, the smell of iodine at 3 in the morning. In the dark between the sagebrush and the sky, in the place where every star felt like surveillance, she had nothing but her training and a stubborn, private anger at the government that called her a ranger and then turned its back. So Maya hid him. She wrapped Kyle in a thermal blanket she used for wolf rescues and hauled him into the back of her battered Toyota, the one with the dented bumper and the stickers that read, "Keep out and don't forget the moon." She drove with the windows down because the cold desert air seemed less likely to betray them than the heat of her lungs. He shivered under the blanket in waves, each flap revealing facets of color that shifted with the light, like an animal trying to remember its skin. When he whispered, the words came in fragments that fell into her like pieces of glass. Not a warship, envoy, memory burden. They will take. His hand clamped on hers, translucent fingers with an urgency that was almost human. Do not let them read it. Maya thought of the file she had seen once, stamped top secret and buried in her memory like a splinter she never let anyone pull. It had spoken of captured craft, of containment, of children with human eyes who could say more than they were told. It had also listed names of those who asked inconvenient questions and then went missing. She thought of Chavez's steady laugh and the way he joked about deserts being good at swallowing things whole. She tasted shame like dust. Protecting Kyle wasn't just about mercy. It was an unpaid debt she carried against herself, a chance to do something right when right had been muffled by orders. The next morning, the county called it a strange weather event. The local talk radio called it a meteor shower and traded in jokes about government cover-ups and alien tourists. But by dawn, a black humming had threaded the sky. Drones, low and patient like wasps. And somewhere inland, a car full of men had a license plate that matched a vehicle Maya had seen in Hoover Dam's subterranean lot, black with the emblem of a bureau whose name she refused to say out loud. Agent Elias Crow's photo had been on Maya's old clearance list, an image of a man whose jaw looked as if it had been chiseled from policy papers. Crow was the kind of man who understood how to turn legal authority into the final word. He represented the teeth behind secrecy. When she first saw him through her binoculars, leaning against a sandstone ridge, silhouette like an exclamation point, Maya felt something colder than the wind. Crow's presence here didn't mean he expected to find a wounded alien in her truck. It meant he expected someone to have already handed one over. In that expectation lived the machinery of containment, the subterranean world the government had built beneath Area 51. Vaults with humming lights, labs with glass-insulated rooms, children who learned 2 languages before they could speak one. Maya knew rumors. She had learned the taste of them in briefings and in the bar after shifts, when men allowed themselves to trace the outline of fear with cheap beer. But knowing doesn't equal believing until the thing you hide coughs up starlight in your hands and asks you, very humanly, not to let them in. She set up camp in the lee of a shale outcrop and used old military tricks to mask her signal, turning her phone to airplane mode, burying the vehicle's GPS under spare clothing, using an old festival tarp to make a windbreak. She burned sage because her grandmother swore it kept spirits at bay, and because ritual felt like armor. Cale slept like someone afraid to trust darkness. When he woke, his skin hummed under the blanket like a keynote. He learned with an appetite born of fear. Words became a bridge between them. "Water," he said first, his mouth lavering salt from a canteen. Later, he mimed a star, then pointed to the horizon and traced a slow arc as if to show his fall. Each attempt at communication reshaped the space between them until it began to feel like a fragile room of 2 chairs. "You could be a weapon," she said once, because the desert had taught her suspicion. "You could be a bomb." He closed his eyes. The light across his forearm dimmed. "We are not weapons," he said. "We are carriers of memory. We hold histories so others can speak. Too much remembering can—" He swallowed, and the guitar of his throat strummed. "It can break worlds." There was knowledge in that phrase that cut like a blade. Maya had seen memory used as leverage, reported on labs where the past was dissected and fed into machines, where children had been encouraged to remember places they never walked in exchange for a vocabulary of safety. She could imagine the Bureau's appetite, to probe Kyle until his mind spilled not only star charts, but the diplomatic dossier he carried. Records of contact, minutes of council meetings the government had refused to attend. If the Bureau had its way, those records would be weaponized. If she protected Kyle, she would be protecting a truth that could undo their tidy narratives. Their days folded into a rhythm of survival: scavenged food, whispered vocabulary lessons, a nightly check of the horizon for the drone's black dots. Maya washed his wounds with alcohol. She scolded herself for stealing from a first aid kit at the ranger station, and told him stories about the earth to stitch him back to something steady. He learned to say sky and sand and Maya with a care that made her feel like a saint in a church whose roof had been blown away. And affection came slow as thaw. Small gestures, a hand placed on her knee when a night tremor of memory shook him. The way he tracked the sun with his eyes, as if memorizing the passage of light across her face. But hiding is always an economy of fear. Neighbors who notice the new tire tracks, an extra bottle of diesel, the way the dog at the next farmhouse starts to bark at nothing. Someone else in this county kept lists of strangers, of car registrations, of people who asked too many questions. There were, too, rumors of a mole, a man at the diner who could point out a black-suited vehicle from 50 paces and then keep his mouth shut when asked how he knew. Maya had learned to swallow details. Her silence felt like a shield until it began to feel like a cell. Crow's resources did not merely hum, they sang. He had helicopters that could crisscross the desert in half an hour, and men with interrogation techniques that could make a person unlearn names. He had access to the subterranean world itself, A corridor of secrets where hybrid children practiced two tongues under the safety of reinforced glass. Vaults that smelled like cold iron and ozone. The bureaus had long ago created a vocabulary for the unexplainable: contain, study, control. Maya had spent nights cataloging those words until they dulled like a coin rubbed by many palms. But in the face of Kyle's small human fear, that vocabulary seemed obscene. One evening, as dusk bled into the ground and the first drone made its approach like a low, inevitable question, Kyle touched her face. His hand was cool and faintly electric, fingertips leaving a trail of heat where they passed. His eyes searched her profile as if storing the map of her cheekbones and the scar that cut across her eyebrow. "You were a medic," he said, the phrase a soft thumb on a wound. "You know how to hide a life." Maya had no answer for that but a laugh that tasted of dust. "Sometimes you hide things because you're ashamed," she said. "Sometimes because you're afraid they'll take what matters and leave you empty." She watched him trying to balance the two kinds of truth. In the blinking light from his forearm, a tiny image flashed, like a hologram, an upside-down ring of dots. "A memory code. What is that?" she asked. His throat trembled. "A ledger," he said. "A ledger of who we met and when. The Council expected humanity to be a different kind of neighbor. There were mistakes." He looked at her as if weighing confession against safety. "They took them too early. You bury your mistakes because you are afraid they'll demand repairs." There was an ache in her chest that had nothing to do with the long nights or the constant watch. It was the old familiar hollow of guilt, the vacancy left by the choice she had made when Chavez disappeared. How she'd swallowed her voice because what she knew could not be proven without evidence, because the Bureau's whip was sharp, because speaking up would have cost more than her conscience could bear. Now, protecting Kyle felt like the only honest motion she could make toward reparation. He was fragile and impossible and stubbornly alive. He was also, she feared, a key. When the drone's searchlight finally swung over their camp like an accusation, Maya dug Kyle deeper into the tarp-lined cavity she had made and pressed a hand over his chest until the thudding of his heart translated into a plea she could understand. The light cut the desert into stripes. The humming grew louder. She closed her eyes and let the wind carry her breath away into the night. Somewhere in the distance, a radio cackled, an unmapped frequency that translated into a single phrase Maya had heard before in the mouth of men who made choices for other people. "Secure the perimeter." Her hands steadied. The desert had taught her that courage is not dramatic. It is a series of small, deliberate acts. She had one more choice left in the immediate moment. A choice between hiding and surrendering the fragile thing she had sworn to protect. Her muscles remembered her training. Her heart remembered Chavez. She breathed in, felt the grit of the sand in her lungs, and decided to stand in the space between both histories. Protecting Kyle would be dangerous. It would also be necessary. She slipped into the night like a thin lie, and the stars watched her. She moved like someone who had practiced vanishing, soft steps on sand that remembered boot prints, a shadow folding itself into another shadow. The tarp's flap made no sound against the rocks. Kyle's breathing was a whisper against her palm, an animal rhythm. And when she lifted the tarp enough to slip herself into the shallow hollow beside him, he flinched as if surprise could hurt worse than capture. "Listen," she told him, though it was half warning and half promise. "Not a sound, not a word. When I tell you to move, you move like the desert moves, slow, steady, unseen." He watched her with a concentration that was almost devotion. "Maya," he said. And though his vowels were still learning the shapes of English, they wrapped around her name with something like reverence. He tried to smile, and she imagined the memory ledger inside him cataloging that expression, filing it under human kindness. She tried to imagine the ledger's owner, an entire people with a trust economy based on memory, and the thought made the back of her neck prickle. If Crow's men reached him, they would pry that ledger open until the lights in his head revealed the names of every envoy they'd greeted, the dates of contact, the locations where humanity had been invited to sit at another table and had refused. Those names could topple careers, nations, and the tidy illusions of safety the Bureau sold to the public. They held their breath until the drone passed and the desert exhaled with them. Maya counted her breaths like a mantra. 1, hold. 2, release. She could feel the pressure of choice settling on her ribs. Protecting Kyle meant she would live perpetually on the edge of exposure. It meant friendships would fracture, and neighbors would look at her with the uneven pity of those who suspect but do not know. It also meant she might be able to prevent the ledger from being weaponized. All at once, fear and duty braided together into resolve. Over the next days, hiding became a choreography. Maya taught Kyle how to move like a shadow, to keep his steps light, to breathe through his nose, to bury the little trills of sound he made when he was remembering too much. She cut his hair short enough that it wouldn't catch on things. She taught him to pass for someone sleeping in a roadside camper, to fold his thin limbs over a pillow and let the sunline on his face suggest a dream. She taught him to whistle like a man who belonged to no one. In return, Kyle taught her to listen in a language she had never learned. Not to words, but to the micro-frequencies of breathing, to the way memory can be a presence heavy as a satchel, to the soft intelligence that lived inside his eyes when he watched the sky rotate with patient sorrow. "You are keeping me alive," he said one night, and the translation of that sentence landed with violent tenderness. He pressed his forehead to hers, reckless in the way of the newly rescued, and for a moment the heat of it chased the cold out of her bones. She wanted to tell him she wasn't doing it for gratitude or cosmic duty, but for the hollow she had vowed to fill since Chavez. But confession is a dangerous thing. It can widen a wound or stitch it. So she gave him a surgeon's answer. "I'm here," she said. "We keep moving." Their closeness felt like a secret treaty. They agreed on small rules. Never leave the vehicle unattended for more than an hour. Always bury the scent of cooking fires in ash. Never trade smiles with strangers long enough to invite questions. They rationed water and rationed hope. When Kyle slept, his arm light pulsed with a rhythm that matched the desert's heartbeat, slow, steady, contained. When he woke, sometimes the ledger flickered, showing him flashes of other worlds, other faces, and his hands would fly to his head in panic. Maya learned the contours of his panic like she had learned first aid. Calm, talk, distract. She hummed songs she remembered from childhood until the edges of his terror softened into a new landscape she could enter without fear. But secrets attract attention, like heat attracts lightning. A teenager with a drone hobby posted shaky footage of a glowing figure near the old salt flats. A conspiracy podcast picked it up and spun it into a cottage industry rumor. Crow responded not just with helicopters, but with a strategic patience that ate at Maya's nerve. His agents began to stake out the diner, the gas station, the county clerk's office. They asked questions about who had been seen on the roads at odd hours, who owned the battered Toyota, who had bought large amounts of bottled water. Crow's inquiries were polite but precise. They were like needles designed to puncture the skin of the community's complacency and release its secretions of truth. Maya felt watched with the animal intensity of prey. She covered tire tracks with sweeping strokes and let the wind scrawl its own erasures. She moved Kale at night across ridgelines and under the cover of a ruined ranch's skeleton. He traveled like a ghost, guided by a woman who had become an expert in the nation of margins. But as they moved, the ledger's weight in Kale's mind seemed to increase. He began to wake more frequently at night, repeating fragments of foreign songs and names that clicked like keys inside her skull. One dawn, in a wash of pink that made the desert look like it was bruised, Kale said a name that stopped her breath. Chavez. The syllable landed between them like a stone. Maya's hands stopped mid-fold. She hadn't told him about Lieutenant Chavez. She had guarded that loss like a lockbox. She had not wanted the memory of her colleague to be a compass anyone could use to steer her. "You know him?" she demanded, and the hardness in her voice surprised her. It had the edge of someone who still carried a file of unanswered questions in the folds of her uniform. Kale's fingers trembled as he touched his forehead, then closed his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was small, but the memory it carried was vast. "I remember faces taken, names left hanging like clothes on a line. I remember a man with a laughter that sounded like rain in a tin roof. He smelled of cigarettes and diesel. The image he painted had the visceral clarity of true remembering. I remember fear in his eyes when the men in black asked too many questions." Maya felt a current of cold run through her. Memories moving from Kale's ledger into the world of people who could act on them changed things. That he remembered Chavez deepened the stakes. Kale's ledger did not merely hold star charts and diplomatic minutes, it held witnesses. If those witnesses existed in Kale's mind, they could be coaxed out, corroborated, and used to prove things the Bureau had buried. Maya realized with a sick twist that she had been protecting not just an alien, but a walking archive of inconvenient truths. A week later, the mole announced itself in the form of a simple paper cup filled with burnt coffee left on her truck's hood. On the side of the cup, in a smudge of lipstick, someone had written in a looping hand, "We know you're hiding something. Turn it over." It was the language of threats disguised as neighborly admonitions. Maya's heart collapsed into a hollow that felt like surrender. Who had left it? The diner woman who knew too many things? The man who mopped the gas station floor and smiled with no teeth? The possibilities snapped at her like hungry dogs. She took the cup inside and stared at the smear until her reflection turned into someone she didn't recognize. This was the cost of secrecy, the slow erosion of the ordinary. Her phone buzzed, an encoded message that pinged with the kind of algorithmic caution reserved for people who had been taught to hide in plain sight. It was from an old friend at the base, Javier, who had served with Chavez and now had a throat full of guilt. The message was brief and raw. They asked questions. They asked about you. They asked about deserters. Be careful. He added a single line, the punctuation of his fear. I think Crow is more tangled than we thought. Maya knew then that Crow's reach had found lines in the community that she had believed impenetrable. He did not only rely on force, he cultivated fear and dependency. He promised safety in exchange for silence. He could whisper a name and watch people bury it. More dangerous than Crow's men were the people who whispered to them. That night she watched Kyle sleep and measured the distance between his chest and the ledger's glow. She felt like a seamstress looking at a dress made of fragile things, threads of curiosity, buttons of memory, a hem sewn together with vows and fear. She wanted to stitch them together and keep them safe, but every time she imagined stitching, 1,000 small hands reached up, pry open, and tore. Kyle woke with the feeling of being unmoored. They will come from me with questions made of metal, he said in the early light, and the imagery of it made her fingers clench. They will try to cut away what is not machine. They will say, hands, mechanisms. The ledger will be reduced to data. They will not understand the care with which we hold histories. They will think power is in extraction. Then we make it harder for them to extract, Maya said. The line came out like a vow. She had been a medic who bandaged wounds. Now she was a guardian who needed to learn how to guard more than flesh. She began to plan in earnest. Not just how to hide Kyle, but how to move him farther away, to a place where the desert ran into another country or another border that Crow could not cross with the legal ease he held like a shield. She mapped routes on the back of a card she kept in her boot, tracing unmaintained roads that ribboned out like old scars across the map. She thought about safe houses, old friends who owed her favors, and the one man she hated to call but might have to, an ex-field operative known for his quiet departures and quieter loyalties. He had once whispered to her, in a different life, that the desert could be a lover who keeps your secrets if you knew how to please her. She wondered if the desert still remembered that language. The problem was that time itself had become a hunter. Crow did not have to be everywhere at once. He only needed to be patient. He could wait until a storm covered tracks, until human impatience invited complacency, until a single cup of coffee became evidence enough to seed paranoia. Maya's refusal to surrender Kyle had consequences outside her own moral ledger. It was drawing threats toward neighbors, toward Javier, toward the old woman who sold pies, and who had once been kind enough to offer a laundry line. She had promised to protect Kyle, but could she balance that promise with the knowledge that every secret stacked like a house of cards on someone else's life? The answer came in a conversation that started like a confession. They had been camped near an abandoned airstrip when a windstorm kicked up and the sand stripped clean the day's footprints. Kyle sat with his legs drawn up, looking small and fierce, and he asked, simply, "Do you regret Chavez?" Maya's laugh was a dry thing. "I regret the shape of my mouth when I said nothing," she said. "Regret is a long scratched film you polish with action. I'm trying to polish." He watched her as if memorizing the way she held regret. "You can repair something by telling the truth," he offered, in a voice that had the soft authority of someone whose species had built marriages of memory. Not all truths destroy. Some make space. She wanted to believe him. She wanted the ledger to be a tool that carved new rooms out of old lies, and not a weapon that made people vanish. The idea of exposing what lay under Area 51, the subterranean vaults and the diplomatic file that said humans had been invited to a meeting they had not attended, was a promise of chaos. But chaos might be the only thing that could crack a system built on secrecy. Still, action required allies. Crow's men were not just men. They were a legal network, a chain of command, an entire architecture. Facing that would require more than courage. It would require strategy and people willing to break with the comfortable dishonesty of obedience. She thought of Javier, of the ex-operative, of a journalist whose nose for patterns had once gotten a congressman into trouble. She considered the cost of each person she might ask, the weight of leverage she might offer in return for help. For the first time since she had unearthed Kyle from the sand, Maya allowed herself to imagine a different kind of future. Not a hideout forever, but a narrative in which the ledger's contents were not squeezed into weapons but used to call the world to account. It was a dangerous fantasy, a map with a bright X that marked treachery and possibility at the same time. She understood the risk. She understood also that if she didn't move from protection into action, the ledger would become a tomb. A rumble of distant engines snapped her back into motion. They had been speaking quietly, planing ideas like paper planes, when the world demanded more than promises. The desert's horizon boiled with the approach of search vehicles, too many to be coincidence. Agents in black moved through the wash like a tide of teeth. Crow's voice had a way of being everywhere at once. She heard it in the hum of their engines like an answering drumbeat. She grabbed Kyle's hand and felt the ledger's warmth against her palm, a living thing full of grief and care and 1,000 small luminous memories waiting to breathe in the light. "Move," she said, and it was no longer an option. The push and pull of the next hours would test every seam she'd stitched into their plan. The desert would decide whether their story would be about survival or surrender. They ran toward the ruined airstrip, their shadows clinging to their heels. Kyle moved with a grace that belied his exhaustion, limbs compact and efficient. Behind them, the agents were in approaching mathematical inevitability, their boots arranging themselves in a pattern of capture. Maya's lungs burned. Her heart felt like a drum in a festival of fear. She thought of Chavez and of the ledger and of the choice that had sat like a stone in her throat for years. If she was finally to speak, to act, it would have to be by running into the teeth of authority and pulling truth into daylight. The night swallowed their tracks, and the wind wrote over their footprints as if trying to save them from being found. But the desert keeps records in ways that are not just footprints. It remembers the arc of decisions and the weight of courage. As they crossed the plain of cracked tarmac, Maya took one last look back. The black-suited men were at the ridge now, their silhouettes carved against a moonless sky. Crow's presence was a slow, precise geometry closing in. She tightened her grip on Kyle's hand and stepped toward the next choice, not merely to hide, but to move the ledger out into a world that would maybe, finally, have to answer. They moved like desperate promises, fast, graceless, memorized. The tarmac cracked underfoot, old seams catching at their boots, as if trying to make them pause. Behind them, Crow's men fanned out with machine-steady precision, lights carving their shapes into the world. The agents didn't shout. Shouting wastes breath. They moved with the economy of people who had practiced assuming someone else's life. Maya felt her lungs fight the cold air and the remembered weight of resignation, the old, useful lesson that orders were easier to follow than truth. She thought of Chavez's last laugh, thin as a wire, and felt the memory cleave something loose inside her. "We cut through the scrub," she hissed, dragging them away from the runway's brittle openness toward the cluster of Joshua trees where the shadows stacked like beginning pages. Kyle's hands were made of different histories, long, quick fingers that could find a path between stars and thorns without making noise. He followed, eyes wide and trembling, cataloging the shapes of the earth like a cartographer forced to draft a new coast in a single breath. Each time they ducked behind rock or crouched beneath a collapsed hangar, the world narrowed to the sound of boots and the cadence of their own heartbeats. They had no illusions about luck. Crow would have sniffed the air for pattern. He would have already guessed movement vectors, probable refuges, the routes a woman with a battered Toyota might take. The agent's net would tighten like a wrist. Still, Maya had spent years learning to make a plan out of half a map and stubbornness. She pushed those lessons into motion. False trails, cached blankets, an old radio that emitted a static storm to confuse direction-finding arrays. It was amateurish compared to the Bureau's arsenal, but intimate, personal, small acts that carried the smell of human improvisation and fear. A flare of light suddenly blossomed above the ridge, and Maya tasted rust. Helicopters, two this time, cut the sky into hungry slices. Their search beams were surgical, white and remorseless. A silhouette passed overhead, and the desert shrank away, exposed. Cale crouched low, pressing his forehead to his knees, as if that could keep his memories from spilling out in the same way rain washes ink across paper. "They will read like thieves," he whispered. "They will look for currency in what we guard." Maya wanted to say they couldn't, but she'd seen the lab prints, the trays of children who learned to speak both tongues, the way technicians labeled pain as data. She had tasted the bargain of compliance, safety in exchange for secrecy, and it had left a metallic tang in her mouth. "Then we make sure they can't find the ledger," she said instead. The ledger in Kale's mind was not paper. It was impression and echo. But even an impression can be traced if you know where to look. They had to move farther, cross a border no black-suited agent would think to cross, find people with the courage to hide a story rather than sell it. They circled an old cattle corral where rusted barbed wire created a maze of echoes, and Maya remembered the man who had taught her to read wind. He'd been a taciturn rancher who used his cane like punctuation. One sharp tap meant danger, two meant move. She had called him once in a different life, when she needed a rip in the world to stitch. The memory was small, brittle as a dried leaf, but contact was better than isolation. If he still lived at the edge of the county, if he still kept his grudges as warm as his stove, he might be the kind of person who would accept a ledger as payment for bread and shelter. A sudden crack of voices made them freeze. An agent's voice barked out a coordinate number that translated into cold logic. Perimeter sweep 90 degrees, East Ridge. Crow's men were methodical. They split the search into arcs and swept them like a comb. Maya felt panic rise like a tide and shoved it back down. Panic is hot and animal. Strategy is cool and deliberate. She crouched, cupped her hand around Kale's elbow, and pulled him toward a tangle of mesquite. "We can't get to the ranch directly," she whispered. "We go through the wash, then up the old pipeline. It's slower, but fewer cameras." He nodded without making a sound. There was an odd and private violence in his compliance, a surrender to the human rituals of navigation that made him seem almost like a recruit learning to move in a new army. Every step he took left a mark on her, a small, fierce gratitude folded into the muscle of her chest. They moved with that kind of intimacy that is not yet romantic, but shapes itself into fidelity. Shared risk, shared breath, a pact sewn from the barest strips of trust. As they crested a low rise, lights swung past beneath them, like fish flitting under a moon. One of the helicopters banked close. Its searchlights sliced across the plateau, and for a moment the world became a black and white photograph. No warmth, no middle ground, just shapes to be judged. Maya flattened herself against the soil, and felt Kyle do the same. He breathed closer to her ear, and she heard a sound she had not expected. An internal prayer, a sequence of clicks and hisses that might have been a blessing in another tongue. When the beam passed, their relief was a thin thing. The air smelled of dust, diesel, and fear. Crow's presence felt mathematical, an algorithm of inevitability. She had to rely on the ragged arithmetic of human improvisation, points of misdirection, the use of the terrain, an old man's grudges. Ahead, the pipeline rose like a forgotten promise, rusty and half swallowed by sand. It would carry them out of the direct line of sight, but it would also slow them down. Maya weighed the choice and found the answer in the small, luminous heat of Kyle's palm in hers. They followed the pipeline, stepping over sections where metal bones protruded like ribs. It was slow work, the tedium of survival. Small decisions, careful treads, the constant calculation of sound. At one bend, Maya paused and plucked a scrap of reflective tape from her pack. She used it to create a false glint ahead of their trail, a tiny lie that would throw off a tracker trained to follow light. The simple act felt almost criminal in its effectiveness, and she grinned despite the ache. It was there, in that moment of small triumph, that the world shifted. A soft metallic click sounded, and the hairs on the back of Maya's neck stood up like a warning flag. She looked down to find a device no bigger than a thumb, embedded in the sand like a seed. It was a microphone, or a locator, or both, cheap and effective. Someone had been watching the pipeline. Someone had known to wait. The reality of the mole pulled taut the line of their plan. The smooth architecture of Crow's Reach had a many-jointed tail, and it had just flicked. Maya wanted to curse. Instead, she reached for Kyle and dragged him into a small alcove under the pipe where a cactus threw a quarter moon of shade. They pressed their backs to the rust and listened as the desert resumed its ordinary noises. An insect somewhere in the scrub, the distant groan of a truck starting. But the small device hummed a different frequency, a purring that translated into one single fact. They had been tracked. "That means Crow has someone here," Maya said, low, the words pulled from a place of cold clarity. "Either a mole in the town or someone in the bureau who likes to know where people are before they move. Either way, he isn't just using force, he's using people." Kael's eyes reflected the device's tiny diamonds. He touched the cactus with gentleness. His fingers traced a slow arc on the pad as if learning textures anew. "They harvest people," he said. "They take stories, then they take the people who have them." His voice was small and full of an ancient sorrow. "Your kind is very good at burying yourself in rules." Maya felt a hot spark of anger at that. It was easier to be furious at abstractions than to admit the ache of real culpability. She had been obeying rules when Chavez disappeared. She had let fear be the governor of her mouth. The ledger in Kyle's head had the power to expose that silence, to make it communal and unignorable. And now, with a device in the sand and agents combing the land, the ledger's revelation might be imminent. "Then we changed the rules," she said. The sentence felt like a verdict. Changing rules required allies, and allies required confession. There was a cost to speaking, but staying silent had already cost too much. She had a list of names she would have to betray to keep Kyle. Perhaps it was time to invite the ledger to do its work, to let memory become testimony, to let the buried speak. Kyle's gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her small. "If you expose them," he said, his words deliberate, "they will come for you. If you keep them hidden, they will come for what they can take." The ledger's logic was simple and terrible. You cannot be both shield and silent. She thought of Chavez's bunk, of the file she'd once seen, of the children in glass rooms. She thought of Javier's frightened message and the woman at the diner who left the coffee cup like a punctuation mark. There was no elegant answer, no hero's map that avoided harm. There was only the hard arithmetic of consequences and the accumulation of small courages. She felt the desert's wind press into the hollow of her neck, a cool hand, as if the land itself were waiting to see which path she would choose. "Then we find who will take the ledger into the light with us," she said. The plan had a name now, not merely escape, but exposure. "We find a journalist who can't be bought, a friend who hates secrets, a path that Crow won't step over without trampling the witnesses on his way." Kyle's hand closed on hers. It was a small, tenacious pressure, an agreement. "We must be careful," he warned, "but there is courage in your chest. It is like a small moon. It will pull tides." They rose together under the rusted pipeline and moved, cautiously, toward the next stage of impossible choices. The desert accepted their movement with indifferent stars. Behind them, men in black recalibrated their sweep. Ahead, the map offered only more options that were not really options at all: exposure, resistance, or slow disappearance into the ledger's silence. Maya felt the weight of those three like a ring of iron around her ribs. She tightened her jaw and walked on. The ledger inside Kale gave off a faint, steady glow. Proof that memory, once sown, cannot be entirely hidden. It is a seed that finds root in the cracks of truth. The question now was not whether to protect it, but how to plant it in soil that could bear the bloom or the fire it would invite. She thought of Chavez and the small room where orders had been given, and of the ledger that might bring them to account. Whatever path she chose, she knew that fractures were inevitable. The question was which fractures would create room for something new, and which would snap the bonds they still held. They hit the county road under the teeth of a sky gone iron. Crow's sweep had tightened into a ring, and the agents moved with an economy of motion that made the desert seem crowded. Maya tasted metal and desert salt. Her lungs felt raw from running. Her hands ached from clutching Kale like an anchor. Each step forward was a choice she had already made 1,000 times in her head. Now the world demanded she make it with foot and breath. "Listen," she hissed, lowering them into the lee of a sagging guardrail. Kale's shoulders rose and fell against her ribs. He held himself small, a learned humility. It was the posture of someone who had been taught survival through containment. Maya's fingers found the ledger light beneath his shirt and pressed as if to steady it. The pulse there was panicked, but not yet broken. "We're going to rattle their map," she whispered. "You ready to be loud?" He blinked slowly, the motion like a tide. "I can make them remember," he said. It wasn't boastful. It was a promise that carried old sorrow. "I can make the ledger sing names. But naming is a rope. You must be ready for who climbs it." She thought of Chavez, of the bunk left empty, and the silence that followed. She thought of the children behind glass, blinking in 2 languages, like strange, deferred gods. She thought of everything the Bureau had kept under locks, and the men who kept those keys. Naming would be rupture, but secrets had already been violence. She nodded. "Then we'll climb together." Their first move was small and mean. Maya rigged an old CB to broadcast a sequence of radio transmissions she'd recorded at the base. Routine fare, logistics, supply runs, the kind of banter that lulls a net into thinking checksums are normal. Then she slipped in something that wasn't on any manifest, a voice she had hidden for years, Javier's. He owed her for Chavez. He had a voice the public could believe, polished, human, and raw with the memory of service. Maya had taken one of his off-duty tapes, spliced it into the CB feed, and wrapped it around static like a secret in a secret. The plan was not elegant. It was human and therefore messy. At dusk, when Crow's men were already exhausted from the geometry of searching, the feed went live. A recorded Javier spoke into a radio, then paused, as if thinking of his friend. "Chavez never liked secrets," the recording said. "He'd make you smash a door to get a truth." Then the static swallowed the rest. Agents on the perimeter picked it up. Heads turned. Phones pinged. The net shifted like an animal sensing a different wind. The move bought them time. Not much. 2, maybe 3 hours, but enough to slip into the rust-buried heart of the old cattle roads where Crow's thermal cameras had trouble reading the skin of the earth. Maya moved with a surgeon's precision. Drop a false trail here, a discarded jacket there, the faint scent of diesel in one place, and the sound of a truck starting in another. It was theater for hunters, and it worked. Men who had been fed maps of probable escape routes lined up like trained birds and flew in the wrong direction. They reached the farmhouse at twilight, a squat, stubborn structure whose porch light had been mercifully left on. The man who opened the door carried a cane and a memory like an old rifle. He viewed the world with the patience of someone who had watched too many winters. Maya had not spoken to him in years. He remembered the time she had run to his barn to hide from a storm and had given her a blanket without asking why she needed it. He was the kind of alliance that didn't require promises, just debts. "You brought the sky with you," he said when he saw Kale, and his voice was not surprise so much as the recognition of a weather report. He led them inside without questions, because some people in the desert had cupboards reserved for inconvenient truths. He fed them stew and let them sit at a table scarred by 1,000 meals. His hands tremored when he poured coffee for Kale, but he did not flinch away from the alien's iridescent skin. There was a steadiness to simple hospitality that felt like a miracle. While Kale ate, Maya and the rancher, Tom, worked quickly. Maya's plan was not to stay underground forever. She wanted names out into the open, a chain of witnesses who would make Crow's authority porous. That meant uploading evidence, fragment by fragment, to a journalist they could trust. Lena Ortiz, a woman who had made a career out of turning small records into moral avalanches. Lena was a risk, but the kind of risk that sometimes men like Crow stumble. Maya had one shot, a shaky USB, some field video of Kyle, confessions from Javier and Tom, and a ledger excerpt carefully coaxed from Kyle in small, safe pieces, detailing one meeting between envoys and humans taped at a ranch 40 years ago. It was enough to start the world asking questions. They prepped the upload like medics prepping a wound. Tom kept watch at the window. Javier was supposed to be the human voice in the files when Lena needed corroboration. Maya's hands shook when she attached the drive to the laptop because it felt final. Kyle sat on the floor, leaning back against a kitchen cabinet, and hummed a tune that bent light. "Do not make them hurt you with knowledge," he said softly, fingers hovering near the USB. "Knowledge is the thing they harvest." Maya thought of the ledger as a living thing, a fragile, honest archive that deserved more kindness than the Bureau would give. She thought of Chavez and the girl behind the glass, and she pressed the drive into the machine and pressed play. Video spilled across the screen. A starlit meeting, handshakes that looked like miracles, men with human faces, and a figure leaning like a comet. The footage was grainy, but the archive had authority. Dates, faces, a timestamp. Lena would know what to do with it. They had just started transmitting when the lights outside pulsed like the beating of a drum. Crow's men had found Tom's property. Someone had betrayed them, or the trackers had tightened. For a moment, the world compressed into the sound of boots on gravel and the metallic whisper of orders being given. Maya felt something cold press at the base of her skull, the knowledge that exposure costs blood. "Finish it," she told Kyle, because there was no other verb that would do. He plugged his long fingers into the worn keyboard and let memory run like a river through his hands. Names flashed onto the screen, faces from the ledger, ministers, scientists, a child's laugh captured in a meeting hall. Cale's translation unfolded into confessions. He didn't give them everything, he gave them enough. The agents smashed into the kitchen like a wave. Crow's voice cut the room. Clear, legal, practiced. "Hands up. Move away from the machine," he ordered. Maya felt the weight of his certainty settle in the air like ash. "Not yet," she said, to no one but the room. Then she stood. She had planned to fight and run and maybe die in a way that got something out of the Bureau's hands. Instead, she did something that felt older than strategy. She used herself as leverage. She stepped between the agents and the laptop and looked at Crow as if offering her chest as a payment. "If you want that drive, you have to take me," she said. Her voice did not shake. It was the kind of sentence whose consequences were unavoidable. Crow's eyes measured her, saw the bruise of guilt and the hard line of someone who had already buried a life. He could have ordered a shot then. He could have followed protocol and taken Cale and the drive and left her body to some forensic ledger. He hesitated, the tiniest fraction of time where principle and policy briefly crossed blades. In that pause, Maya saw something else crack in Crow's face. A recognition, faint as a reflection, of his own ledger. Cale reached for her hand then, fingers warm and oddly human. "No," he said, and it wasn't a refusal, but a barter. His arm light pulsed bright. He placed his palm over Maya's, and the two of them made a small, fierce circuit. He was offering a different kind of sacrifice, a transfer. "Take me," he told Crow quietly. "Take me and leave her." It was clean and terrible. He spoke from a place where memory ethics were not shaped by power, but by preservation. "If you take me," Cale added, looking Crow dead in the eye, "you will also take what I hold. You will not break me without being broken. You must know that." For a moment, the room tilted on a hinge. Crow's mouth opened and closed. He could seize Kale and the knowledge and justify it legally. He could also, if something animal in him moved, if conscience or vanity or fear of the ledger's light nudged, refuse. The choice hung between them like thunder. "You think I'm naive," Crow said finally, voice colder. "You think I don't know the leverage of a bargaining chip." "Maybe," Maya replied, "but I'm tired of being bargaining against silence." Crow's jaw flexed. Then he lowered his weapon a fraction. It was not mercy. It was calculus. "You come with us," he said to Kale, "and you will cooperate. Or you die." Kale's light dimmed a fraction, an almost human flinch. He lifted his chin. "I will not be weaponized," he said, then softer, "but I will not let you make her into a lie." The agents moved in. Hands closed on Kale's thin body with gloved certainty. Maya let them take him, let them cuff him and haul him like a bounty you'd seen in old, ugly films. She felt the ledger inside him like a warmed coal. She thought of all the things she couldn't fix, and of the one thing she could, her voice. "Wait," she said, when Crow's boot hit the porch step. "You will not put him in the subterranean vaults alone. You will not experiment on him. You will not try to extract friends from his memory without oversight." Her voice was bargaining. It was a medic's bargaining. You give a little to prevent a worse wound. Crow paused at the threshold, the embodiment of a machine that had been designed to make only one kind of moral calculus. He looked at the drive on the counter, a live transmission still blinking, and at Kale, whose hand clutched Maya's with a stubborn, ancient gentleness. In that look, something like defeat, or perhaps the memory of his own child, flickered across Crow's face. "We will conduct meetings under supervision," he said. It was the limp compromise of a man unwilling to be idealistic. Maya let them take Kale, because sometimes sacrifice is not annihilation, but a gamble that pain can purchase a different future. As the agents led Kyle into the back of a black SUV, he turned his head, and for the first time, without the apparatus that had translated his words into her skull, he formed the shape of her name with his lips. "Live," he mouthed. The word was small and terrible and more intimate than any vow. Maya answered with a promise she could keep. "Expose," she said, and handed the drive to Tom, who had sat like a broken clock, immobile and watchful. "Get this to Lena. Get it everywhere. Make the ledger a story the world can't ignore." They closed the door and the vehicle roared away. Maya watched it vanish, a black cut in the desert, swallowing the man she had loved like kin. She did not chase. She had nothing left to throw but herself. Inside, where dust motes trembled in the lamplight, she felt the ledger's echo in her blood. Kyle had chosen to be taken to protect her. He had made the sacrifice willingly, offering his memory as shield. It was the kind of loving that hurt more than any weapon, deliberate, self-erasing, and luminous. She sat at the table long after the lights went out, the room a wreck of scattered plates and a laptop with a transmission still alight. The world was shifting. Crow had Kyle. The Bureau claimed a victory. Yet a seed had been planted, footage broadcasting into networks that could not unsee. The ledger's names were out like sparks in a dry winter. Maya pressed her palms to her eyes and whispered the name of the man she'd failed once, a benediction and a confession. "This time," she said into the dark, "I will not be silent." Outside, engines continued their patrol. Inside, the laptop blinked like a beacon. The sacrifice had been made. Now the work of redemption would be public and bloody and real. Maya rose, set her jaw like a hinge, and reached for her phone, the old weapon of the disobedient. She dialed Lena's number with hands that trembled but did not break. When the line clicked on and a familiar voice answered, Maya began to speak, and with each word she unburdened something small and essential. A ledger of truth turned toward daylight, a promise that she would no longer only protect but proclaim. The cost would be high. The cost had already been paid by a being who,